It's my honor and delight to introduce Professor Laura Arnold Leibman. She is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed. After earning her bachelor's in English literature at UC Davis, she then earned her master's and doctorate at UCLA, writing her dissertation, Crossing Cultures, Algonquin Indians and the Invention of New England, reflecting an early interest and commitment to a wide-ranging humanist bent of mind and work. Laura came to Reed in 1995 as a visiting assistant professor of English and Humanities and has been there ever since, steadily climbing the ranks to full professor in 2010. She's published widely and has an impressive array of awards and grants, including a Fulbright Senior Scholar in American Studies at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. It was such a pleasure earlier this week to watch the Jewish Book Council Award ceremony, where Laura was the first person in the history of the group and the award to receive multiple awards in different categories for this book that she's going to be sharing with us today. And it was just such a delight to see her, and she had such wonderful remarks for each category. It was also so nice that I found out about the Laura winning these awards, not through Reed or not through Laura directly, but through an email I just happened to receive from the Jewish Book Council. And so it was just so delightful to see that she had won these awards. Rather than attempting to summarize Laura's accomplished career, I would like to share with you just a short section from Laura's autobiographical section on her website, which I highly recommend to everyone. She writes, "My work as a humanist is indebted in many ways to the time spent helping my parents with biological field work as a child, and my prior work in animal health care and conservation biology. My parents and step-parents are all biologists, and I spent many hours as a child helping collect snakes, lizards, and salamanders, both in the tropics and at my father's field sites at Eagle Lake and Prairie Creek. These early experiences not only taught me about research methods, but also trained me to pay attention to details. Noticing and responding quickly to a sudden small shift in light often meant the difference between catching an animal or ending up empty-handed. My stepfather's research in the tropics also exposed me to other cultures and gave me a love of travel. Haunted by places that I did not understand, and many years later, I would find myself returning to some of these locations, such as Panama and the Dutch West Indies, to do my own historical work." And as I say, that just gives you an idea of where she started and some of her roots. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I'm going to share screen with you. If you can't see the screen, whoops, something disappeared, but that's okay. If you can't see the screen for some reason, let me know. So basically, I'm going to give you an overview of the book, and I'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of the different chapters and the objects that I talk about. But I would love it if, as I'm talking, if you come with questions and you feel like you're missing something important, obviously you can put the questions in the chat, but if there's something where you don't understand and you need to interrupt me, that's totally fine. I'm used to it, and you won't throw me off, and I'll still be able to finish my presentation. So don't worry if some crucial piece is missing, feel free to signal it along the way. So as Wayne mentioned, I mainly started off as an early Americanist. And for about the last 20 years, in spite of the fact that I teach in an English department, I mainly publish on material culture. And while I started off in Native American studies, for the past 20 years or so, I've primarily worked on Jews in the colonies, and those are primarily Sephardic Jews, Western Sephardic, so people who went from Iberia to Amsterdam or London or Hamburg and then came to the colonies. And a lot of my early work, particularly the work from a couple of books ago, Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, was on the typical kinds of Jewish objects that you might expect. It was things like synagogues and gravestones and houses and food and things like that. So much more typical Judaica. And as I was writing that book, you basically, in order to get a book contract, you have to send out a chapter early on in it to reviewers. And early on in the process, I sent out the materials, and you inevitably get back 2 reviews in the humanities. And one of them is usually nice, and this one was very nice. And the second one is always cranky. And we refer to that as reviewer number 2. It really doesn't matter what order they're in. But there's like this mythos in academia about the evils of reviewer number 2. So you have somebody like Joe Sharp saying, like, I had a paper rejected once because I didn't know the work of Joe Sharp well enough. I am Joe Sharp. That has actually happened to me, where I've been called out for not citing myself. They didn't know it was me. I was like, because I don't want to look like a jerk. That's why I'm not citing myself. So we all hate reviewer number 2. And there's this like thing of like, why does reviewer number 2 hate me? And like, so people say like reviewer number 2 doesn't even like puppies. Reviewer number 2 is so evil. Mm-hmm. So I, of course, had one of these early reviewer number 2 experiences, even though the book would go on to be well received. And reviewer number 2, whom I affectionately think of in my head as Gollum. So Gollum had many, many things about the book proposal and sample chapters that Gollum did not like. They were things like, I was taking too many risks. And I was like, really? Because I feel like that's my job as a scholar, is to push the boundaries of things. It's not to be like super safe all the time. There were just like 10 pages of little nitpicky things that reviewer number 2 didn't like, but they also included major things like reviewer number 2 suggested if I wanted to publish this book, I should get rid of the discussion of messianism. Now, you'll remember the title of the book had messianism in it, so you can imagine I wasn't thrilled with that idea, and that was basically like saying, like, you could publish this book as long as it were on a different subject. So, eventually I sort of threw off what Gollum had to say and sort of went with a different press. And it ended up winning a couple of awards, so I feel like, sucks to Gollum. So I sort of feel like that, I kind of got over it. But one of the things that Gollum said, other than I should, basically stop taking risks, was Gollum didn't like my chapter on ritual baths, because Gollum felt that the ritual baths chapter wasn't getting at what women really experienced about it. It was just about the baths, and it wasn't about, like, what did women have to say? And I felt like, sure, Gollum, I would like to know what women had to say, but it's a taboo subject, and women during this time period didn't write about it, right? So like, if I had that, I would have put it in there. It wasn't like I was like keeping something back. So I had this sort of feeling of like, on some level, totally unfair. On the other hand, it kind of registered with me of like, why do we have so very, very little written by women from this time period? What is behind that? So that part of Gollum really sort of influenced this next book going forward, of thinking about what is the story about why, beyond this case of the ritual bath where people didn't want to write about it for reasons of modesty, why were we not having writings by women from this time period? And I'm certainly not the first person to notice this. So Jacob Rader Marcus, who collected 1,000 pages of documents by Jewish American women, has, from before 1800, only 60 pages of the 1,000. And most of those 60 pages aren't even by women. And similarly, other scholars had sort of noted, there's almost nothing by women from this time period. So moving on. So basically, when I did find things by women, I also noticed that they tended not to be exactly what you would have wanted women to have written. I mean, I think this is a problem for historians more generally, that we always feel like, if I could go back and ask people to write things down, I wouldn't have had them write down the things that they wrote, if that makes any sense. But this was particularly true for what we had left from women, from Jewish women from the colonies. So An example is this very early letter by Hannah Louzada that's from New Brunswick, New Jersey. She's writing to Congregation Share Israel in New York, asking them for assistance, for some of the financial assistance that as a pensioner she's supposed to be getting. And I felt like this is kind of a weird random moment in this woman's life that surely was much more complex than this one little, what we call begging letter. So how do I make a life out of these weird little fragments when we did have them? And basically, scholars have had two responses to the lack of sources of the fragments. One is throw up the hands in despair and just say, like, forget it. I'm just going to go back to time periods where women wrote more prolifically. So that's sort of the first thing people do is, I'll just wait until the later part of the 19th century when women wrote things that were preserved. The second thing that people have done to solve this problem was really to focus on the one or two women from this time period, Jewish women, who actually were prolific writers. So these are women like Rebecca Gratz or Abigail Franks, who just wrote tons of letters, and graciously their families preserved them for us. But the problem in my mind with that approach is these women were not the norm for Jewish women during this time period. These are very exceptional, wealthy women who had time to write and to buy the paper and all these different things that made the preservation of their letters possible. It would be a little bit, even just putting politics aside, if somebody wanted to write a history of American Jewish women today and they only had the writings of Ivanka Trump, right? Like, she's just not the norm for most of us, right? So I sort of feel like, and I feel like that does Rebecca Gratz and Abigail Franks a little bit of a disservice, but you get the idea of what I mean. Like, it's a weird data set, basically. So what I started to do was to really think about how objects might be able to fill in some of these gaps, but wanted to move away from the kinds of objects I'd used before, which were much more centered on the synagogue and ritual life. So things more like this Kiddush cup, which is over here. This is actually one of my favorite Kiddush cups. It's made out of a coconut, and it's from 1803. It's from the London Jewish Museum. And if you can see the details, it's actually showing a scene of men holding up Kiddush cups and having a Friday night ritual. So Kiddush cup is that ceremony on Friday nights that's part of bringing in the Sabbath. And for this time period, it would have been very male-centered. So, like, here's a cup and it's all about men, right? So I wanted to not focus on cups that were, or objects that were part of men's rituals, which were most of the objects from this time period that people typically looked at. But I started to turn it to a different kind of object and a different kind of Judaica than people typically were looking at. So things more like this cup that's on the right-hand side, which is a cup that depicts a Jewish town called Yodin Savannah, which is the first semi-autonomous Jewish town in the Americas. And you'll notice it even, let me go back. It even has the synagogue here as the tallest building. But basically, unlike the Kiddush cup, which would have been used by men, these kinds of teacups were part of women's rituals. So they were something that the oldest woman in the family would have led a tea ceremony. And it was much more centered around women's discussions and women's use of objects. So I sort of shifted what kinds of objects I was looking for in this book. The other thing that I kind of noticed was there is something weird about this cup, because you'll see there's this little nubbin on the back corner of it. And I immediately thought, what is that nubbin that I see there? So I asked the curator, this is from the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, the Jewish Historical Museum. I said, this is why it pays to suck up to curators. Don't put this on the web. She'll know now my strategies. But I said, could you go into the archives and like flip that cup around and just let me see what's on the back? And when she did, this is what we found, that the cup was actually, this is the back of the same cup. It's actually missing the handle. So that's what that little nubbin was. So I became really interested in how this cup was in many ways representative of women's objects for me. Like that earlier letter, they're kind of fragmentary, both in the sense that sometimes like the cup, they're literally missing things like the handle. But in other cases, fragmentary in the sense of they're just a little piece of somebody's life and we were missing a lot of the story. So this cup is interesting in part because, while we know some things about it, it depicts Yod and Savannah, these cups were usually part of a sequence and we're missing all the rest of the sequence. So these kinds of cups of vista scenes were very popular during the time period in the early 19th century when it was made, but typically they wouldn't all be the same scene. They'd be related scenes. And we don't know what this one's related to. Were they all Jewish scenes from the Caribbean? Or is this just one of many scenes of Suriname, the country where it was in, and this would just happen to be Jewish? So again, I was sort of missing this information. In addition, we don't know the original owners, who they were. So again, this sort of feeling of fragmentation as being part of the story. So this led me back to that letter that I had been looking at originally, and really trying to think about how fragmentation and the lack of information was actually part of the story that needed to be told about Jewish women during this time period. What had led to their works being not preserved, not deemed worthy of being preserved, not deemed worthy of being in the archives, and so that we were left with these weird little fragments or pieces of what they had to say. So I'll read you this letter so you get a sense of what I mean by the kind of fragments in it. She says, "Sir, I take the liberty to write you now. I think that it's time for you to get my winter's provisions, likewise a little money to buy some wood for the winter. I would have come down myself to fetch it, but being disabled, my legs having swelled. But I hope, sir, that ancient proverb, not out of sight, out of mind, sir, here applies to me. Sir, here I lay suffering for want of wood and provisions, and remain, sir, your most humble servant, Hannah Louzada. Remember my love to your spouse and the rest of your family." So basically, again, it's this weird little moment, like, what could I make of why we only had this fragment left from her, similar to just like a little piece of a cup and not the rest of the story. So I really became interested then in thinking more broadly about what were the things that caused us to be missing women's voices from the archive. What could we learn from those kind of silences? And in this chapter, I'm really interested in 4 different forces that contributed both to the original erasure of women's voices and then the lack of them in the archives. And those were charity, education, the role of secular laws, and finally mental illness. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by the way that those were structuring how she was left out of the archive, some of the previous people who had looked at this letter had noticed her English is a little wonky, right? So one scholar has put it that she wrote almost unintelligibly, and I was like, well, that seems a little harsh, but important, right? Like something's off about her English. So she says, for example, I would come down myself to fetch it, which she writes as all one word, which is not really standard for this time period. But I was really struck by, okay, her English is a little wonky, but her handwriting is lovely for this time period, particularly for a woman. But basically for anybody who's on the poor rolls, she's actually very well educated in terms of how to write. It's just that her English is a little off, which made me curious about why was that aspect of her education? What was going on here that I could uncover? So one of the first things that I was drawn to, besides the beauty of the way that she writes, is that she has this lovely little flourish underneath her name, and that's called a rubrica, and it's a hallmark of somebody who's been educated either in Iberia or in one of the Spanish and Portuguese, the Western Sephardic Jewish communities, that they're being educated to preserve that aspect of Iberian culture even when they're in Amsterdam or London. So this gave me a hint that it is possible that her education is focusing on something which is not on writing in English. And indeed, I was able to find a couple other letters by her, also begging letters that she had written to one of the most famous Jews in the Americas, Aaron Lopez. In fact, that's why they got preserved, because somebody was excited that they were to Aaron Lopez. So it was just random. They actually mistranscribed her name because she didn't matter. It was only him that was interesting. And they're in Spanish, and they're actually in this sort of lovely Baroque Iberian Spanish that was part of the training of elites during this time period, both in Iberia and in places like Amsterdam and London. So it's something that people would have been trained in. They called it teaching the children to ladinar, which to them meant to speak and read and write in this Baroque Spanish, so that they could read the prayer books, and also even the Torah was transcribed into Spanish, and this very elevated thing. So you get these lovely echoes in it where she's playing on words, and she's clearly been reading all the Spanish books about how to write an elegant letter to get somebody to pay attention to you. She's just so well educated in Spanish that it's completely out of keeping with the English. So this made it pretty clear she's not a native speaker of English. She's probably a native speaker of Spanish and Portuguese. And like many people from this time period, most likely was born in Iberia, where she received her early education and then came to Western Europe or the colonies. So it really gave me a sense of not only is she married to somebody Sephardic, but probably she is Sephardic herself, which is something we didn't know about her before. The other thing I was really interested in is the very first piece of writing we have from her is when her husband dies and he leaves no will. This was very much on my mind during the last year of like, I need to go out and do a will because of having seen what happened when you didn't leave a will. So this was the inventory of her husband's estate. And she wrote her name, and can anybody see what she wrote it in? Then somebody wrote her mark, Hannah Louzada, implying that they thought she was just scribbling. Does anybody recognize the language of the scribble?
Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. So that was interesting to me too. Like her very first piece of writing was somebody assuming she was just like scratching on the paper, but she actually wrote her name in Hebrew, which suggests again that early on in her life, she was most likely educated in Amsterdam or London or Hamburg, one of the big Western Sephardic communities where even girls would have been taught Hebrew as well as those elegant Spanish and Portuguese. So English is most likely at least her third, if not her fourth language. It makes much more clear what was going on there. So this became very important to me for thinking about why we were lacking in records. When I looked to see when we were seeing women in the archives, women like Hannah were almost always being represented either when they were in life cycles, so they were giving birth, they were dying, when they were misbehaving, which sadly wasn't very often. Those are the funnest things. You'll get some woman being like, ah, and running about the town and people are chastising her. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all that often. Or in this case, the vast majority are these begging letters of women being on the poor list. And this helped me understand how women got on the poor list. Women, the vast majority of people within the early communities were poor. So just like in secular non-Jewish society, over 50% of the Jewish communities, people were impoverished. Most of the people who got pensions from the synagogue were women like Hannah who had been widowed. And the reason why she has to sign her name here is because her husband didn't leave a will. And in the part of New Jersey she lived in, if her husband didn't leave a will, she didn't get a dime. So if she'd lived in a different part of New Jersey, she would have gotten a third of his estate. Instead, because of the secular laws, she gets nothing. And her son can't even take care of her because he gets deemed insane and all of his money goes to the town. So her oldest son's complications further give her problems in terms of her life. So again, we see this issue of women are not being educated in the language of the local communities. They're being educated in the religious languages, Spanish, Portuguese, and Hebrew. So when their husbands die, they have often a very hard time taking over their stores and running the businesses. And this causes many, many widows to end up on the poor rolls for the community It's either that or going into the poorhouse. We end up with these really tragic letters from women like Hannah who are being forced by the way that charity works to every year have to ask, like, can I have my regular pension? Just so she can buy food and wood to get by. So this was really for me that moment of thinking about fragmentation from this letter, was trying to think about these larger patterns instead of just thinking of her as incompetent as she had been sort of presented before. Think about why was she not able to succeed with her store? What sort of structural things were keeping her from being able to be successful and from being able to leave a different kind of document for us that was about the rest of her life. In the second chapter, I turn to a different kind of object, which is more kind of typical object-like, which was looking at silver. And here, instead of looking at the kinds of silver that people usually look at, which are objects that are in the synagogue, so like a Torah, the little rimonim, the little things on the crowns and the bells on the top of Torah scrolls. Here I was really interested in the kinds of objects that women were in control of, such as this set of originally 6 silver cups that was made by Reyna Levy Moses's uncle, a very famous Jewish silversmith, Meyer Myers, and that were given to her and her husband as a wedding gift. And I was really interested in how women were able to take objects like these silver cups and use them to connect the generations through the way that they were giving them to other people. So typically silver is something that is exchanged during wedding ceremonies as part of the rituals, as well as when a son is born. So it is part of this ritual life. But here I was really interested more in how an everyday object would have those same kind of resonances. So Reyna ended up giving it to one cup, for example, to her son. He passed it along to a nephew, and then finally it went to her grandson. So we see through these different scratches and moments that are written on the bottoms of the cup, Reyna being able to determine who should inherit what from her family. So there's 6 cups. This one in particular says, for her, Sally only, and this is one that was for one of her single daughters. And then here we see another generation marking on the outside of the cup, trying to inscribe like who's it going to be given to next. It was given to the birth of her grandson. So again, this sort of movement of cups through the family as a way of preserving family traditions. And so I had asked you guys to bring in, did you get the instructions about bringing in an object?
Yeah.
Okay. So at some point we'll come back to that, but this is where I think part of my interest here was like, once we see something appearing in a museum collection, it's often missing that original context of how it functioned as something passing between relatives, and as being part of maintaining lines. So I was really interested in tracing that kind of story again, of thinking about how the people who owned it not just used it originally, but how it worked to connect the different generations. So here we see the original stamp from the silversmith. This is Reyna Moses, her married last name, her husband Isaac, and then Reyna scratching on it that who she wanted to have it be passed along to. And her daughter, Sally, or Sarah, she legally was known, also in her own will was very particular about how she wanted to pass along the legacy of silver objects as a way of creating emotional bonds between the different members of the family. But Reyna herself, in addition, was very careful that her children would not fall into the kinds of problems that we had seen the woman in the previous chapter fall into. In fact, her husband had been on that synagogue board deciding whether she would get her money for her wood. So Reyna, in her own will, is very particular that in spite of secular law, she's going to protect her daughter's inheritances. Even if they marry, the money will not go to the new husbands. So really, we see this sort of movement by women trying to reclaim some power over the finances that they have so that they don't get stuck in these positions of poverty. In the third chapter, I turn to a different kind of object, which is an ivory miniature. that was owned originally by a woman named Sarah Brandon Moses. These miniatures are about this big. They're super small and very portable, and they are definitely part of the marriage circuit during this time period, that people would exchange them sort of across long distances in order to find a beloved, in the sort of way you might send a photo later, but also are for when you want to keep somebody close to you and they're traveling. So Jews were very mobile during this time period, and these miniatures were one of the most popular forms of portraiture during this time period. So Sarah Brandon Moses is somebody, even given the role of miniatures during this time period, is very unusual. She's born in Barbados in the main town of Bridgetown. She grows up on a street called Swan Street that you see they put, or Jew Street. There's a lot of Jews who live on it. It's right by the synagogue. And so she grows up in a household, but she grows up not as a free member of that household, but as an enslaved member of the household. Her father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, is one of the wealthiest Jews on the island. She has another brother who is also born enslaved, and they're living with the Lopez family, so some friends of the Brandons. And that not only she and her brother, but 4 generations at least of her family were enslaved to this particular family on the island. And when Sarah's very young, her father makes sure that she won't have to spend the rest of her life enslaved, and pays to have her and her brother freed. When she's about 11 to 12, she goes with her brother to Suriname, where that teacup picture was from, and she ends up converting officially to Judaism because she wasn't recognized as Jewish by the community in Barbados because her mother had not been born Jewish. So she goes to Suriname and she converts, and then later in her life, when she's about 15, she goes to London, where she is sent to a very elite Sephardic boarding school and learns how to become part of the upper class. And while she's there, she marries a young gentleman named Joshua Moses, who's actually the son of the woman in the previous chapter, Reyna Moses. And he has his own miniature, as you can see. But part of what happens in order to solidify that marriage is the making of that miniature. And in this chapter, I'm really interested in the way miniatures for Jews during this time period aren't just something convenient that you could use, but are really about a lot of the racial discourse that's happening around whiteness and Jews and race during this time period. It's a period when we see a rise of scientific racism, and even for Jews of solely European ancestry, there's a lot of tension about whether they should be given full civil rights, whether they should be considered white, or whether they have the same rights as free people of color, particularly in the Caribbean. So one of the things that was very interesting to me about her miniature is the way that the paint technique relates to these issues of racializing of women in portraits during this time period. So the ivory miniatures are from a very thin, cut very thin sheet of ivory off of elephant tusk, and then they're painted with watercolor so that you can see the ivory behind it, and it kind of glows. Whoa! The sort of whiteness glows through. In fact, people will sometimes put a piece of silver behind the ivory so you get a reflection of the light coming through, and you get this, again, this kind of magical glowingness. So what's interesting to me about her portrait is we see kind of standard ways of applying the paint. Watercolor slips off of ivory a lot, so you see people either doing these kind of hatchings that you get for the darker areas, which make a nice kind of texture for hair or for background, or you see these cute little dots as a way of applying things. And the portrait maker manuals from this time period are really clear. Women, you should be really careful not to put too much paint on their faces, or they'll look too masculine. And in fact, one of the things that happens during this time period is when we have multiracial women or women of African descent being depicted in the miniatures, we see this racialization of the women. So everybody has a skin color, but here we see that skin color deliberately being marked as somehow flawed through the lens of the white portrait makers. So you can see they're using that technique of hatching, but they're using it to suggest somehow their skin is scratchy. So There's something wrong with their skin in terms of the way they applied the paint. There's other ways that you can apply the paint so you still get a kind of glowing skin color. We don't see that during this time period. And so it's very interesting that Sarah's and her brother's miniatures rely on that sort of emphasis on whiteness that's going on. And indeed, she ends up, after she marries, she and her husband travel back to New York, where they enter into the Jewish community in New York. In spite of the fact that members of her slave owners family live in New York at the time, and that there's plenty of people from Barbados, she gets, her race gets reassigned as white during that time period. So we do see this way in which her miniature helps prepare her as part of this new vision of how race is changing as she moves around the Atlantic world. And if you're interested in that story, my book that's coming out in July is all about her and her brother's family. So looking at their beginning of starting and through to, she has 10 children before the age of 30, only one of whom dies young, and looks at how she goes around in the Atlantic world, how her race is assigned differently in the different places she lives, and what happens to her children and her grandchildren. So out in July. The fourth chapter I choose, I'm going to speed up a little bit here and then we'll have time for Q&A. I look at a different kind of object, which is called a commonplace book. People who've either seen or read Jane Austen's Emma will sort of remember that Emma and her friend Harriet go around and they have this little book that they want the goofy minister to write something in, and then they're trying to interpret it. That's a commonplace book. So they're kind of like social media. It's like Facebook of the 19th century. So it's something you would post, you would write things in and you draw things, but your friends would also put their ideas and the things that they like. They would post them to your page, into your commonplace book. So I was really interested with her of mapping out who are the people that she's intellectually relying on. Turns out more Christian even than Jewish. A lot of her Christian friends write Christian things in her book. Not as many Jewish themed ones. She's super into romantic writers. So really positioning herself as part of the sort of classy milieu of the time. She, her friends are mainly the people who write their own things for her, as opposed to just writing famous quotes. She has a lot of stuff from the Renaissance too. So in addition to like helping us understand the intellectual life of women for this time period, I was really interested in who wrote in it and like kind of what message they were sending to her. That group of people that she collects ends up being very important for her later in life. She marries a gentleman who's in the army, and he's from the South. And when the Civil War hits, he basically has to decide whether he's going to stay fighting for the North where he was living and betray his own family in the South, fight against his brothers, or like his family in the South wants, if he's going to betray the North and go flee to the South and become somebody in the South. And he says, could I just go to California and be in the military in California and nobody will have any of that? It's like, no, you have to pick a side. He ends up quitting the army, and they fall back on her network of both intellectual and personal connections that she's made in this commonplace book that she works on for over 50 years. And she starts a school, and she and her daughters support the family when the husband is out of work. And then finally, the last chapter, I look at silhouettes, which are, I don't know if people, when I was a kid, we used to make silhouettes, but they're very popular during the 19th century. They're kind of right before daguerreotypes come out. They're like the cheapest form of portraiture. So we have many more of them than other kinds of portraits. And I was really interested in this one Jewish family who comes to New York during this time period. The wife and husband are also from London. So you sort of see how New York is becoming this place in which people are there, but not permanently there. They kind of move in and out of New York. She also grew up in an orphanage. He was her teacher. He got the job. He had to be married. Like that, they got married in a week, and she was on a boat to New York. He ends up taking over the first Ashkenazi synagogue in New York, and very much is on the front of fighting against the reform movement. So I was really interested in how this particular silhouette helps us understand and fits with his propaganda about women's roles and the role of orthodoxy. He thinks the reform movement is very bad for women, orthodoxy much, much better. So very interesting how he's trying to take on women into the movement and the role of the family. And in fact, her role in this silhouette is very different than women's typically is during this time period. So that's it. The book has these 5 different objects where I'm really interested in thinking about not just adding some objects by women, but really trying to think about how does this change the way that we think about histories, including of places like New York, which will later be the center of all Jewish life for the Americas, and really trying to think about big takeaways. So some of those takeaways would be, 1, if we want to think about women's history, we need to, for this time period, we need to be thinking about what caused women's lives to be constrained and for most of them to be poor and not educated in the languages of documents that would be preserved. Second, who gets to decide what goes into archives? People like the guy who's collecting documents about Aaron Lopez and puts all of his stuff in there. And so women sort of get in by accident. Third, that the kinds of things that women are doing are not necessarily the way we would have thought about what's good writing for this time period. So there are things like that Commonplace book, which people are like, it's kind of like a scrapbook. It's like social media. It's not the lone genius vision of what it means to create a work of art, but is very indebted to the ways that women are part of building these networks and familial bonds during this time period. So at this point, I will stop sharing screen, and I would love to open up to some questions from people. I hope there's some questions in the chat. Do people need a bathroom break really quickly?
So I've been tracking, this is Amy, I've been tracking some of the questions from the chat bar.
Okay, thank you.
So Jane Neff Rollins said, in what part of New Jersey were widows of interstate husbands not entitled to dower rights at which time period? So
so there's a difference between East and West New Jersey, and I can't remember which is which at this point, but one side of New Jersey, you don't get the dower rights, and the other side you do. So there's this sort of bitterness, I feel, for if she'd only lived in the other part of New Jersey, then she would have actually had the widow's third that the people would have had. So it must be whatever portion of New Jersey that New Brunswick is in is the wrong side for women. But good question. And this is the time period we're looking at before the 1850s. So the 1850s is right around the time when you start to get women being in charge of their property in different sorts of ways, and the property rights change. So, but this is from the 1760s. So, yeah.
I saw another question from the chat bar. Susan Swordlow, do you want to ask the question, or should I read it for you?
That's okay. I can ask it. The woman in the miniature.
Yeah.
Was she enslaved because her mother was a slave?
Yes, exactly. So her mother. So fortunately, the records allow me to trace back her maternal line 4 generations. So she and her siblings, and her mother and all of her mother's siblings, and her grandmother's generation and her great-grandmother's generation all had belonged, at least that far back, had belonged to the Lopez family. So she was born enslaved, and it's not until she's about 3 that her father sort of puts down a lot of money and pays for her to be manumitted. Yeah. It's a good question. I see a question from Anne about what was the word for the flourish under the signature. I'll put it in the chat. It's called a rubrica. And then I'm noticing that Wayne had a question. Can you address your work in material culture more generally? Wayne, what kinds of things are you interested in?
I guess I note that your book is part of the Bard entire series on culture.
Yeah.
And then I was particularly interested in your concept in the book of reading silences.
Yeah.
And we don't have a written archive of doing history from the materials.
Yeah. So I would say this was kind of why I was setting it up with the discussion of Gollum at the beginning, that a lot of my earlier work on Jewish objects tended to be much more standard discussions of Judaica. So usually when we look at Judaica, we're talking about objects that are made holy through their use in rituals. And for the time period that I work on, that has an unfortunate consequence of men being in charge of most of the rituals. So it means that inherently the way I would define Judaica kind of leaves women out of the picture for most of the time. The big exception to that would be the ritual baths. And again, Gollum didn't like that I didn't have women talking about their baths. But so for me, part of what I was interested in here was trying to think about challenging a little bit the way we think about what a Jewish object is and how Jewish identities are being created and perpetuated, with the sense that I'm not just a Jew when I'm in the synagogue, or when I'm performing rituals. In fact, that might be a really small proportion of my life. And I'm not the first person to have noticed this. There's Barry Stifel, who I put up something by before, has an article where he's like, why are all the objects, the only objects that people look at are gravestones and synagogues? It's like Jews are only Jews when they're in the synagogue or dead, which most of us would say, like, I'm a Jew the rest of the time too. So like, what kinds of things that I do to construct a Jewish identity and pass along Jewishness and notions of what it means to be a Jew that don't involve those kinds of objects? That was a lot of what was behind it, of trying to think about how my very way of constructing Jewishness would skew who counts as being a contributor to Jewish identity. Yeah, so I see from Diane Solomon, were women involved in creating these personal prayer books and books containing the Tachniyot, which are, it's something we associate more with a Yiddish tradition. So it's a little bit more of an Ashkenazi tradition. I don't know that I've seen any from the colonies, probably because the colonies tend to be super Sephardic dominated. So we do have some Yiddish materials, but just to give you a sense of like what I mean by Sephardic dominated, that even the first Ashkenazi synagogue doesn't open in New York until the 1820s. There's an earlier one in Suriname, which is on the northern coast of South America on the Caribbean Ocean or Sea. And but that's the only one early on in the early 1700s, so 1730s. There's this Ashkenazi synagogue, and they're very much the low class kind of Jews in Suriname and throughout the colonies. So and to give a sense of this, like if you're a Sephardic Jew, the Sephardic Jews own the synagogue originally, and then there's too many Ashkenazi Jews in, and they're like, forget it. We don't even want that building anymore. And they move down the street and they make a new building and they sell the old one to the Ashkenazi Jews. But then to keep them separate, they make all these rules of like, if you marry an Ashkenazi Jew, then we're going to demote you, and you can only be buried in the crappy part of the cemetery, and you have to sit in the bad seats in the synagogue, and you cannot be called up to the Torah. So like, it's very clear, like, please do not marry the Ashkenazi Jews. Similarly, the Ashkenazi Jews have their own congregation, but until the 1830s in Suriname, they're still using the Sephardic prayer books and saying their prayers in Spanish. So they finally write to the Dutch authorities and say, hey, could we stop saying our prayers in the synagogue we own in Spanish, because none of us understand them or even know how to pronounce them? And finally, they get allowed to have an Ashkenazi prayer book. So I think that gives you kind of a sense of like, the Ashkenazi Jews, even when they have their own congregation, are really kind of not the norm in terms of how people are practicing. So that is probably part of the reason why we don't have those kind of traditions happening in the colonies in the same sort of way. It's very Sephardic centered. I saw a hand from Jane up.
Yes, I wanted to thank you for the talk. I'm not a historian, although I am a family historian, but what you talked about sparked a memory that I had of my junior high school social studies teacher who took us on a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum, to the Egyptian section, and said, find an object. Do not look at the card that accompanies the object, and figure out what it tells you about the culture. And I thought that was a brilliant assignment at the time. And what you do is what Mr. Green had us do, but within a smaller, more focused population and time period. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Wayne, did you want to hang on with people, or are we calling things to an end? Do you have anything else for people?
Laura, thank you so much. This has been so terrific. I think what we'll do is, if anyone's interested in just chatting about either continuing on these topics or just want to socialize, please feel free to stay on. But I think we are winding up kind of the part specifically on the book. And just, we all want to thank you so much, Laura. This has been just absolutely wonderful, and really.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Laura. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for the idea, Wayne.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Laura.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
It's nice to see everybody. Faces, new faces, old faces.
Thank you.
Familiar ones.
Very informative.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Have a great week.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.